Well, thank you, Orville, and thanks everyone for joining us today for a conversation about Ian Bremmer's wonderful new book on the G0 world. Ian, of course, I'm very proud as a political scientist to see another political scientist who is really speaking to the big major changes underway in the world, getting beyond the ivory tower, even making some money, which is, as a fellow political scientist, I think this is a great tribute to our discipline, but it also shows how politics and governments are really driving so much of the global economy and world affairs, so that the economists, their knowledge is really not sufficient, even for investors as well as ordinary citizens, to understand where we're going. So this book is very interesting. It's got this new concept of a G0 world, and it's really about the problem of global cooperation. It's not so much a book about the competition among nations as it is about a kind of leadership vacuum in the world today. And so why don't you start off maybe by telling us, do you really think that the United States has been an effective leader up till now, and that it's really the loss of American leadership that this book is about?
It's a good, tough policy question from Susan, not surprising. First of all, thank you. I'm honored to be up here with Susan. I think everyone in the Age Society knows her background, who she is, and the service that she's done, not just for our field, but for our country. So it's a pleasure and a privilege.
Well, thank you.
And I mean, I've certainly read Fragile Superpower. I'm delighted it's being revised, not because I thought there was anything wrong with the first one, but because I'm looking forward to the update. Almost spat out her water on that one. And Orville, my dear friend, it's always good to be here. Thanks so many people for turning out for the horrible weather. Do I think U.S. leadership has been effective? Yeah, on balance, yes. I mean, given the alternatives, sure. I mean, we can all point to plenty of places where we've made massive mistakes. Some of the most obvious ones have involved the loss of many, many lives, Americans and others. But when I think about U.S. leadership as the world's superpower, when I think about U.S.-led architecture, I'm not just looking at the last 10 or 20 years. I'm thinking about the post-war order. Well, think about what happened to Japan in that order. Think about what happened to Europe in that order. Think about MacArthur and think about the Marshall Plan. I think that's very effective U.S. leadership, frankly. I think about the Bretton Woods Accord on currency. I think about the World Bank and the IMF. I think about the United Nations. And I think about institutions that reflect the exceptionalism of the United States, that brought our allies together in a series of institutions that reflected our political and economic values and priorities, and that did drive a process of globalization for many decades, U.S.-led globalization. So on balance, if I was to give us a grade of 0 from 10 or from F to A, it would be pretty positive. But it's over. It's over.
When did it start becoming over?
Well, it started becoming over with the rise of these emerging markets. And it's not, I know Fareed Zakaria likes to call that the rise of the rest. I think that's not the problem. It's not the rise of the rest. It's the rise of the different. It's the rise of the other. That's the problem. When Japan and Europe rose after World War II, we didn't have that problem because they agreed with us on fundamental stuff. The other countries coming in, you don't just have a coordination problem. You have the fact that they don't agree with us on many things, right? I mean, look, Putin did not come to the Camp David summit. He decided to keep his toys at home, right? And frankly, that was a good thing. One, if he had shown up, it would have been a tough U.S. meeting, Obama meeting with Putin. It probably would have hurt the move towards normalizing trade status with the Russians by the end of this year, which nobody wants, frankly. But also because we think about the issues that were discussed, whether it's Syria or Iran, democratization, Europe, and the rest. Tell me where the Russians are adding anything to that agenda. I mean,
Well, and you're a Russia hand.
I used to be, yeah, and I speak the language. And I'm very disappointed Russia hand as well. But I mean, let's be clear. There's the G7 plus one. If you're going to a wedding, right, and you've got a wife or you've got a girlfriend, bring her along by all means. If you've got a plus one, leave that person at home, right? Because that person's not going to make you happy, and ultimately, right, you're not going to meet anyone. And so, yeah, I have views on Russia as a plus one. I think the G7 is more effective. I think that, but to get back to the initial question, which is, I think that it started. U.S. leadership started to erode globally when we had the rise of these other markets because all these institutions, these global institutions, were led by the United States. The World Bank sounds global. I love to say this, right? It's not. The World Series sounds global. It's not. These are American institutions. It behooves us to say that they're global institutions, but they are American institutions. And as
kind of tactful for us.
it's tactful.
Yes, right.
It's tactful. But I mean, when they start breaking down, we have to remember that we did it because it was tactful, not because it reflected reality, right? I mean, I was just giving a speech at the World Bank. They get it. They understand. But the underlying balance of power no longer reflected the U.S.-led stuff so I would say that the rise of the other in the last 30 years that was the long-term structural shift. And it got sufficiently great, that difference, that at some point a shock was going to hit. The shock that hit that was big enough was the 2008 financial crisis, and that was the birth of the G0. Do I think that this is a story about the United States not doing it? I think partially it is. It is not a story about U.S. decline. I think...
Because you think that our situation is temporary.
Not necessarily. I think that whether or not you believe U.S. is in decline is irrelevant to the G0. In other words, I don't know how many of you think we're in decline. I don't know what percentage. Let's imagine it's 50. Take a vote. How many people think the U.S. is in decline? Show of hands.
Absolute or relative?
Just decline. Okay, thank you. Don't be wonky on me.
Majority,
Okay.
large majority.
And how many do not? Quick show of hands. Okay. So yeah, but pretty significant. About 65% in the Asian society believe U.S. is in decline. Rising China. Okay, we're good. I think that irrespective of where you come out on that, we're not going to bail out Europe, right? Irrespective of where you come out on that, we're not leading a new global climate deal. We're not leading a Doha round on trade. We're not going to remove Bashar al-Assad from power in Syria. We're not going to bomb Iran, my view. Somewhat more controversially, but I think it's not going to happen. So in other words, this is not really about whether the U.S. is in decline or not. It's much more about whether or not we want to do this stuff. And we increasingly don't, number one. And number two, it's about whether any other country is prepared to play that role. And the answer to that is very clearly no. And so I would argue that in the G0, what we really see is the end of U.S.-led global institutions and architecture and leadership. And we may end up with U.S.-led institutions that aren't global. We may end up with global institutions that aren't U.S.-led. Or we may end up with neither.
Okay, so let's talk about global institutions that are not U.S.-led. What's your expectation, say, of the WTO or the IMF or World Bank? You don't think much of the G20. You think that we may have made a mistake by inviting in so many others to, to make them give them a seat at the table and to try to solve the problem, but they're not solving the problem. But what about these other institutions? Even without American leadership, is the WTO important, for example?
Well, sure. I think there are lots of global institutions that matter. I guess what I'm saying is that to the extent that they start to truly reflect the global balance of power that has now emerged, they will become less effective. So you look at the World Bank and the IMF, they have very strong notions of conditionality when they provide money. They support political and economic reforms that the U.S. and the developed world likes. If the Chinese are going to play more of a role and pay more money, they're going to want different kinds of conditionality. That will weaken the capacity of the IMF and the World Bank to function. Right? It will undermine. So it reminds me of a point. So I had this conversation with Tony Blair a couple years ago, where he was talking about the importance of the U.S. and Britain playing a stronger role in these global institutions.